Go ahead and start the presentation. And what she mentioned that we're going to talk about is not an NFIP 101 and talk about risk rating 2.0 and all the details of the flood insurance program, but basically kind of focus on what floodplain managers need to know. And I strongly encourage you. I can't, the way my screen is set up where I am in this room, I don't have access to see who raises hands, but I will be stopping along the way to check in for questions. So Isabel, who's monitoring that, can read those off to me, or Emily, either one of you. And also we'll be doing a poll question along the way just to kind of check in. And I do encourage you to raise your hand or put something into the chat. We learn a lot by raising our hands. Long ago in my previous career before insurance and all this, I actually was working for a petroleum engineering company, and part of it was early on was teaching webinars, or I should say workshops like this, but in geology and petroleum engineering. And the first one I did overseas was in Caracas, Venezuela. You can tell that was long ago, since no one can go there now. And it was simultaneous translation. And I knew only two words in Spanish, and that was cerveza and baños, beer and bathroom. And so they said, don't worry, that's all you need to know. Everything else will be fine. So we went, we had the simultaneous translation. That was all going fine. And the guy I was doing with was a really old guy. He was 60 years old, perspective of a 25-year-old. And he said, it just kind of mumbled to himself, I got to go get a drink. It was the end of the day. And the translator translated that. So everybody went upstairs to the Caracas Hilton bar and sat down, and we started drinking. Well, a couple hours, and I tried to pretend I knew Spanish by scrunching my lips or putting A after the end of the word. And finally, one of the guys said, well, Bruce, do you keep ordering cerveza? Why don't you order something different? I said, that's all I know how to say besides baños and, por favor. He said, oh, let me bring over the waiter. He brought over the waiter, and I asked the waiter, I looked at the guy and I said, what do I ask him? He said, ask for la cuenta. So I said, la cuenta, por favor, and the guy handed me the check. La cuenta is check in Spanish, and I got stuck with a $180 bar bill. But what I learned, not only new words, but I also learned you learn those things by raising your hand. So please raise your hand, put questions in the chat, and with that, let's go ahead and get started. What I plan to talk about today is a quick overview about the NFIP, but and the flood insurance program, but really get into what's changed, not changed, and then issues that you need to be aware of. I'll finish up with a thing what I call LAGNAP, kind of a Cajun South Louisiana word for extra stuff that I want to share with you that's going on with the NFIP, and then share with you some resources. Probably won't get into the details of the resources, but let you know they're there, because we will be sending a copy of this presentation and this recording out to all those who attend. So what I'd like to talk about is kind of like where the NFIP was. To me, it's kind of like, hopefully up on your screen, you see this old aircraft carrier in for repair. And that's kind of what the NFIP program was like. It was constantly coming into dry dock, being updated and repaired, but never otherwise structurally changing. And then finally, FEMA said, we've got to update this NFIP and bring it into the 21st century. So they created this really cool, slick, stealth rating type system. And they called it, it's their newer pricing approach, and they called it Risk Rating 2.0. And so everybody for several years, it's been out now for a couple of years, knew it as Risk Rating 2.0. But then FEMA said, okay, it's not that anymore. It's just our pricing methodology. So that's how they call it now, and would like us to. But I tell you, they did a great job in branding that. So you'll still hear people, including me, call it Risk Rating 2.0. So if you take a look at or remember back what the original rating methodology was about, we used FEMA data. We only looked at the 1% annual chance flood, and we had basically two rating variables that made a difference. One was the flood zone, and the other was the base flood elevation. But when they rolled out the new pricing methodology a couple years ago, not only did they have that, but they added additional sources, broader range of flood frequencies. The cost of building rebuild was very important. And then a myriad of other variables were put in there. So what I want to do is take a little closer look at those just so you know what makes it up. So first of all, we had the FEMA data sources. Those are still there, but we're now also bringing other data, the Great Lakes analysis that they've done and some other mapping data that they created. They actually have created their own model. Other data sets they brought in from federal agencies was NOAA for the coastal, the Corps of Engineers for the levee, and the USGS for the elevation data. And these are, national databases that they could easily pull on. But they also went to third-party sources. They got catastrophe models in from CoreLogic, AIR, and CatRisk, a geolocation tool telling exactly where that property is from CoreLogic, a first floor height tool from CoreLogic, and a building replacement cost tool from CoreLogic. And Milliman was the actuarial firm that they used to help develop all of this. So really, their goal was to get a premium that was very representative of the flood risk of that specific property, not all the properties in a flood zone. So I want to go over some of the things that have not changed. And those are things like the waiting period, the building contents and limits, the increased cost of compliance, the fees, surcharges, statutory caps, floodplain management, assigning policies, and the mandatory purchase. Those things have not changed. So let me jump into them specifically. We have the waiting period, and the waiting period was created so people wouldn't go out and buy a policy as they think their house was about to be flooded. The traditional one is 30 days that you have to wait. So you submit the policy, you submit a check, and you have to wait 30 days for it to become effective. However, if it has a lender involved, then there is only a 0-day waiting period, and it becomes effective the date that the loan does. But one that a lot of people aren't aware of is a 1-day waiting period. And this is due to map changes. And as you know, Georgia DNR is helping FEMA with their mapping risk map program and helping update all the flood maps continually for the state of Georgia. And so if somebody is newly identified to be in a high risk area, like they went from zone X to zone A, and they don't have a loan, so there's no mandatory purchase, they still can get a 1-day waiting period. And that grace period for 1 day is 13 months from the date of the effective map. So 13 months you have to have a 1-day waiting period. And a lot of agents aren't aware of that because they don't work with map changes that often, 5 to 8 years in an area perhaps. However, the software they're trying to create these days help with reminders to ask the agent if there is a map change. Other things that haven't changed, limits of the building, still $250,000 for residential and $100,000 for the contents for the residential. And then other residential and commercial are $500,000 for the building, and you see the contents there as well. So things have not changed for that. The fee and surcharges are still in place, slightly different, but not much. And the cost of compliance is still there. There are the statutory caps on rate increases. These were put in by Congress that individual limits can't be more than 18%, but there are certain ones that can go up to 25%, and those are the pre-firm properties built before the first flood map was initiated. And to give you an idea of that of a term that I'm going to be using, for those that are on a glide path to a full risk rate, that 25 or 18% annual increase, I want to give you an example because you'll hear me use the term glide path. And we had a lot of properties, policies, almost 50%, 40 some odd percent of the NFIP policies were a thing known as a preferred risk policy. Those have gone away. And what they did was they were just converted into a normal zone X. And they started, let's say this one started out at $500 premium, and at 18% a year, it would reach its full risk premium at $1,500, let's say was its full risk premium. You could tell That could take 7 years to finally get there. So that's the glide path that you hear me talk about through the rest of this presentation. Um, an example policy of what it might look like. How do you know if you're on a glide path? Is that in the first section of your declaration page, like this case, the full risk premium is $11.95. But then you see an annual increase cap discount. So what they're saying is we can't increase your policy all the way to that amount. So the highest we can do it right now is 708. So you're getting a discount of $487. That's how you know you're on a glide path. That discounted premium is where you are, and eventually you're going to get to that $11.95 full risk premium. I want to bring back the pre-firm discussion of that 15 to 18% because the primary residences, as I mentioned, can go up 18% a year maximum. And the non-primary, secondary ones can go up 25%. And that's for pre-firm homes in zone A, D, and V. So what does that mean? Take a look at this picture on the right-hand side. Hopefully it's popped up. Let's say an older couple lived there, and this was their original house. And on the back side is the river. And they're living in a zone A, and it was built before the first flood map, though it's a little newer looking. Let's say it was built before the first flood map. And so they were paying a certain premium, then they decide, hey, we need to move into something smaller. They move out and they sell it to another family, and they tell them what the premium is, and it sounds like it's a pretty good premium, but this family's going to use it as a vacation home. Take the kids down to the river, enjoy it, blah, blah, blah. When they get their premium, suddenly it is way higher. Why? Because it's a non-primary residence, a second home. It's pre-firm, and so its use has changed from a primary to a secondary residence. So just by how the house is being used or occupied can affect the premium. A lot of people don't realize that, and they sometimes blame it on flood map changes, but in reality, it's just the usage of it from a primary to a secondary home. This is an important thing we try to get across to realtors to double check what that usage would be and what that impact might be. Also notice that secondary homes receive a $250 surcharge. This is something Congress created. So not only does it go up to 25%, but it gets a 10 times as high surcharge on the property as well. The pre-firm buildings that are commercial also are affected, that are in zones A, D, and V. Pre-firm and repetitively flooded buildings substantially damaged. So those will increase 25% until they reach the full risk rate. What else has not changed? You can assign a policy to a new building owner. So if you remember that graph of the example of a glide path, if the policy is somewhere on that glide path and I sell my home to you, you can continue on that glide path by me assigning the policy or transferring it over to you. And so you don't start at that full risk rate at the end. So that's a great selling point we try to push and promote to the realtors to let them know, real estate professionals. The mandatory purchase requirement, it's still there. It hasn't changed. It's for federally regulated and insured lenders. And I emphasize that because too often, especially MAP changes, you'll hear your citizens say, oh, FEMA's making me get flood insurance. Well, it's not FEMA. They only provide the flood insurance. It's Congress has anointed the lenders, and the lending industry is the ones to police that and to make sure that coverage is in place. Why? Because if it's a federal loan, the federal government wants to protect it and make sure, should it get flooded, that it can be repaired and it's not a loss. What triggers it is if you're ever making, increasing, renewing, or extending a loan. I remember it through the acronym MIRE. And just keep in mind that insurance has to be in effect for the life of the loan. A couple things I want to also point out to you that since we're all talking on the lender side, related to the insurance and coverage. Mandatory purchase requirement is not triggered if a detached structure, i.e. a garage, is in a high-risk area and the house is not. It used to be that any part, if the detached garage was part of the loan, along with the house, and that garage was in zone A and the house was in zone X, you'd have to get flood insurance. Now they're saying if the house is in zone X and the garage, detached garage is in zone A, that does not trigger the requirement. They also changed the law a few months later that said, okay, it used to be if you escrow anything, you have to escrow flood. Now all lenders have to escrow flood if flood is required on residential loans. And finally, just a few years ago, well, actually, no, it's now 5 years. Wow, going on 6. The lending regulators finally came out with guidance saying we will accept private flood. And boy, did that help open, pardon the pun, floodgates for private flood insurance. FHA had a unique wording in the law, and so they had to come up with a way to get around, or not get around that, fix that, and they did that just a couple years ago. So private flood is also accepted by the lenders. Now, this really isn't about flood insurance, but I wanted to bring this up since we're talking about lenders. Last April, HUD adopted the final rule of the FFRMS, the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, basically helping have the country be prepared for changing conditions and building higher and more safely. And basically, to get an FHA loan, which is under HUD now, all new construction of 1 to 4 residential properties, i.e. homes, located in those high-risk areas, zone A and V, must be built so the lowest floor is 2 feet above the BFE. So you have to have a 2-foot freeboard. Now, some of the communities in Georgia have that. Others have 1 foot. So the question is, well, how do I police this? How do I make sure? How do I let my builders know? Well, I've heard some communities taking their permit form and updating it with a question of, will this house be, or do you want this house to be eligible for FHA loan? And if so, are you aware of the following? So at least, and they have them check a box or sign or something. So they're aware of that because about 1 out of 4 loans in the US are FHA loans. And so that builder could be missing out on a good opportunity of buyers, a good portion of the buyers. So wanted to let you know that has now become effective. What else has not changed is you heard me say, well, you know, BFEs aren't being used, flood zones aren't being used, the elevation certificate isn't being used for rating. What does that mean for floodplain management? Well, flood zones still are used for floodplain management because you have to build according to what the flood maps still say. And likewise, then you need the elevation certificate to show that it was built to the proper height in those high risk areas. And by the way, also, and we'll talk about this later, the CRS program is still going strong. You still get the discount, but the beauty of the change with the CRS is that SFHA discount applies to all zones. It used to be that you had one higher discount for the high risk areas and a lower discount for the non-special flood head area. Now everybody gets the same discount, makes it simpler, and they get the benefit of that SFHA discount. So yep, you still got to manage the floodplain management, floodplain with the tools you've been using in the past. Nothing else has changed. With that, let me stop and ask Emily if there is any questions in the chat.
I am not seeing any questions.
Okay. Well, then, for those that are here, I have a question for you. Isabel, if you can put in the polling question in the chat, everybody look into your chat, and hopefully you will see it there and answer in the chat. And these are questions you need to answer to get the 1 hour CEC credit. A glide path is a formula that defines the asset allocation mix of a target date fund based on the number of years to the target date. Fall asleep on that one. How FEMA describes the annual increases in a flood insurance policy's premium until it reaches a full risk rate. What Bruce is on as he heads towards retirement, or D, all the above. So put in A, B, C, or D, or I guess color the dot or hit the dot. If for some reason you're not able to see it, just put this in the chat so we can give you credit. And believe it or not, that really is a haiku by Peter Newton called Glide Path. Kind of sluggish, like my computer. So Isabel, I'll let you tell me when it looks like you've gotten most in and what the results are.
Alrighty, so the results are still rolling in. I'll give it another minute.
Okay. Again, fill this out if you want CEC credits.
I'll give it another maybe 10 seconds for the last people to get their answer in.
See, this is when we need Brian with his music of the Jeopardy theme or something.
Alrighty, so it looks like 69% of people, this is just in the poll, so I haven't tallied up what people have said in the chat, but
okay.
69% of people have chosen B, how FEMA describes the annual increases in a flood insurance policy's premium until it reaches a full risk rate.
Yep, we'll go with that. You could also put D because actually if you read about on asset allocation mix, that is also a definition of a glide path. And for those who aren't aware of it, I am heading towards retirement at the end of the month. So we could take D or B. So that's great. And I'm glad people picked up on what a glide path is because that is very important in some of the next section that we're going to talk about. All right. Thanks, Isabel. And with that, I do now want to talk. We talked about what's not changing. Well, here are some of the key changes, and there are several, but I want to just highlight some of the key ones. You heard me mention at the beginning when we looked at all the different variables that building replacement cost was a big one, and it certainly is. What we found, and I'll give an example, is that the bigger buildings were paying less, and the smaller buildings were paying more for their insurance based just upon their size or replacement cost. So now FEMA has a tool that automatically generates what the replacement cost is for 1 to 4 family homes and mobile homes and residential units. But I bring this up for an important reason. It's only used for rating. It's not used when it's claim time, and you guys can't use it out there for substantial damage determinations on that. So it's specifically, but this is why it works. Imagine you have a house on the left-hand side. Hopefully it's popped up by now. It's $1 million valued home and a much smaller house next door. Let's say it's valued at 150,000. And that little blue line you see there, let's say the whole area is inundated by 1 foot of floodwater. Which one do you think would have higher damage? Well, hopefully you'll be thinking the one on the left because you just look at all the wall board alone on that first floor that would be damaged compared to the amount of wall board on the smaller home. Yet the FEMA's old way, the legacy was they treated both homes the same. So they understood the inequity of the rating system, and therefore the smaller homes are now going to be actually rated as if they are smaller. So that's a big one, but that replacement cost value is determined by the computer, the database that they have for 1 to 4 family homes, and you're not to use it for substantial damage. Elevation changed in rating and how they rate. As I mentioned, we don't use base flood elevations anymore, and the elevation certificate consequently is no longer required. However, it can be very beneficial. In fact, I have found in talking to write your own companies and agents and their vendors, WIO vendors, that anywhere from 70 to 80+% of the time that an elevation certificate is used for rating, it gives a better premium. So we still want to strongly recommend that if they have an EC, that they use it. And what basically they measure is the difference between the first floor height and the lowest adjacent grade. And they determine that by 3 different ways. One, again, they have a database that CoreLogic has that can generate that information. If they don't have that, then based upon the type of home, FEMA will default to certain numbers. So that's why if you do have the EC completed by a surveyor, that is typically the preferred one to use. But there's a third one, and that is if the homeowner or their agent or you as a floodplain manager or whomever can go out there and you, with a yardstick or a tape measure, you can measure what that difference is and put it into section H of the EC, which doesn't require it to be signed by a professional surveyor, and submit that in to the agent. So even the homeowner can determine that elevation. And that can give a better premium than relying on the system generated number. Another elevation factor, which is new, is what is the house's lowest adjacent grade elevation compared to the surrounding ground? What they're looking for is that ponding or that pluvial, that rainfall type. And if it's higher up, its pluvial risk is lower. But if it's lower than the average ground around it, then it makes sense that its pluvial risk is higher. So that's another elevation that they use, the second one. And the third elevation is how high are they above the flooding source? And as you can tell, the house on the right is not as high as the one on the left. So it would have a higher risk accordingly. Likewise, using that same schematic is how far are those homes from the flooding source? Again, the one on the right is a lot closer than the one on the left. So the one on the left would have a lower flood risk from that perspective. So height and distance from the flooding source were also key. Two other things that I want to talk about is the levees. We do have levees in Georgia, not as many as other places like along the Mississippi or out in California, for example, but any levee that's in the National Levee Database has been analyzed as of 2020. And they use those 5 data key points shown on the side, but really what it comes down to is the levee performance. And that levee performance can only be performed by the Army Corps of Engineers, and I may get into that if there's time at the end. But if you really want to get any more into it, there is this great Levees and Risk Rating 2.0. It's a very short document, comparatively speaking, that really you can get the details specifically in how levees are addressed in the rating methodology. I do want to take time to talk about flood map changes because this has changed. And for those who have heard me over the years or decades of talking about map changes and impacts of map changes, it's a whole new verbiage and messaging. And I want to make sure before we leave today, this is one of the key points you take away because we are continually updating those flood maps, as I mentioned, in Georgia. If you are newly identified to be in Zone A or V, from a non-special flood hazard area or Zone D, you do get a discount. So if you're going from Zone X to Zone A, you can get a one-time discount. And then you'll be on a glide path to full risk rate. You have 12 months to buy that policy from when the map became effective, not from the preliminary map, but from the effective date. There is an exception to that. I won't get into it due to details, but that is the only discount available. Grandfathering is not there anymore. So if you have an increase or decrease in BFE, or you change the flood zone from a Zone A to a Zone V or an A to an X, there is no change in premium. You guys used to hear me lock in that lower risk zone or lower BFE for future rating. That does not exist anymore. And if you did go from a Zone A to an X, you could say, hey, get a preferred risk policy and maintain coverage. The premium will not change. Now, what will change is the mandatory purchase requirement. And so we want you to hold on to that policy if you're going from A to X because the risk is reduced, not removed, but no grandfathering, no preferred risk policy. Let me speak briefly about letters of MAP changes. Speaking of MAP changes, if you get a letter of MAP amendment, that is great because it helps reduce the remove the mandatory purchase requirement. Any premium impacts, though, to this, there aren't any, only if the EC provides updated data. Otherwise, getting a LOMA will not affect a premium, only the mandatory purchase requirement. However, if you get a LOMAR, the mandatory purchase requirement is removed again, but it could impact the premium because there's an elevation change, base of fill. So you're actually changing the home is like higher above the flooding source, perhaps the ground, etc. So LOMAR could affect the premium. Finally, prior NFIP claims surcharges. This is something new. It used to be you could have 30 claims and still no effect on your premium, where if you had 30 claims on an auto insurance, first, you'd be lucky to get coverage. But second of all, you'd have really expensive. So FEMA said, we've got to be doing the same. So there now is a surcharge that started on all claims starting April 1st, 2023. So we're 2 years into it this year. The good news is if a non-compliant building is brought into compliance through mitigation measures, then they can reset your claims history. So there is a way to reduce that surcharge or get rid of it, is by taking mitigation action, which is great to hear. I'm going to stop and take a quick break and see if there are any more questions, Emily. And is that you in the background, Emily, with your cowgirl outfit on, I think? Yeah.
Yep, sure is. How did you get that picture of me?
Well, that's Jared in the front, so that's he sent it to me. So yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. I still don't see any questions in the chat at this time.
All right. Well, then let's move on to what are some of the challenges and issues with the NFIP rating approach. First of all, what we're seeing is those when you elevate, yes, there is a multi-pronged credit for those homes when you elevate them, but the credit is not showing as high for elevating as under the legacy method. So when you're doing your benefit cost analysis, et cetera, I'll talk about a quoting tool that they have now. Double check to see what that premium is, or have an agent calculate out what the new premium might be to see if there would be a significant change to justify elevating a home. We're also finding mitigation discount for flood vents is not very high, as even though it could help reduce, even keep a building from being knocked off its foundation, maybe not a brick building like this, but maybe a wooden structure. You can tell on the right that the discounts are not that high. And may not even pay for the cost of the vents if that's what you're trying to do. Plus, if they are on that glide path that I had talked about, it's applied at the end of the glide path. So if you're on a 7-year glide path and you put vents in on year 2, you will not see the financial benefit, the drop in insurance, until the end of that glide path. Likewise, machinery and equipment. You have to elevate it to the next floor and you get a 5% credit. So where the yellow arrow is on a second-story home, you just have to put them up there. But if you have a one-story home on slab, that means put them in the attic or on the roof, and that's probably not going to make much sense. And so really, I don't see this credit being applied a lot across the U.S. I'm glad to see that we have it. But unfortunately, it too is applied at the end of the glide path. And what we have found that even if you elevate it partially, like we see in their technical bulletins, you will not get partial credit. It has to be up to the next floor, even though it may be up above the BFE. So just want to let you know about that discount. I mentioned earlier about the CRS discount. All zones now get the same premium reduction per CRS class, which is great. But we found 7 issues around that. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, but I want to just highlight. You can look at these later. Some of you may have heard these. But I wanted to cover for you how the premiums are calculated, determined, so you can understand the impact. The first part, there's 3 parts. The first component is they figure out what the full risk premium is. how much the building premium is, how much the contents, ICC costs are. Then they apply the mitigation discount, which is the vents or the M&E. Then they apply the community rating system discount, and they get the full risk premium. Then on that, they apply that increased cap that I showed you. Is there a pre-firm discount? Is there a newly mapped discount? Any of those statutory discounts. And then finally, they apply the reserve fund surcharge of 18% right now, FIA surcharge, all those fees and surcharges. So that's kind of the way they calculate it. But to calculate the first one, what you don't see is that there's a loss and expense constant. Yes, they put a little asterisk now in there of $193 is what it is right now. They subtract that behind the scenes before they apply the mitigation and community discount. So you may see that your premium's $1,000 and you got a 20% CRS discount. And you think, okay, I should have an $800 full risk premium. You won't see that. You'll see it somewhere around $786 or no, 600. Anyway, do the math. They have to subtract that first and then apply the discount. And so when people get their policy, they're going, well, why aren't I seeing my 20% discount? So be prepared for that. There's also maximum premiums that if it exceeds that, you won't see those first discounts on the first part or a maximum rate. They have maximum rates again. But there's nowhere in it that it explains that. We've seen cases across the U.S. where a county or a city has annexed something from the county, and the county was not in the CRS program, and the city is, and yet it never gets transferred over or identified that that part of the county is now the city. So they're not getting their CRS discounts. They may be on a glide path, as I mentioned, like the preferred risk policy. We had hoped that if you see the red line there, that they would have done it like this. Start with a discounted premium with the CRS on it, but they didn't. So that difference between the two, they're missing out. And then if your community improves its CRS class, while policies are on a glide path, again, that CRS discount is applied at the end, that additional 5%, and not at renewal. So in this case, let's say on the right-hand side, you applied it on the second year. So you would say, oh, I really would like to see that discount there. And it would be 121. And then the premium would continue on the glide path, and you'd pay only just over $9,000. But instead, the way FEMA does, we'll apply it at the end. You'd pay $9,300. So that any CRS additional discount for policies on the glide path are done at the end. Keep note, though, if it's retrograded, the loss of the discount because they didn't keep up their CRS program, whatever, that's applied immediately at the next renewal. So we've had a lot of ASFPM members, write in when I was the ASFPM Fund Insurance Committee co-chair saying, how is this equity in action when you don't give the benefit of doing good things, but you get punished for immediately? So finally, there's one called the National Violation Tracker. You can get with Georgia DNR to find out more on that. But basically, you get on this tracker 4 different ways. From the old legacy system, it was a negative rated building post-firm. If they've gone out and done LOMA and they find a LOMAC violation, if they're out doing a CAV and CACs and they see a violation, or they're doing an EC recertification for those communities that are CRS, those properties found can be put on this list. And if they are minus rated, that first bullet, then they will not be eligible for the CRS. There is a fact sheet that ASFPM subgroup of mine put together that helps explain it. And then in the bottom left, you'll see FEMA just came out last summer with an NVT fact sheet to give you more details. So if you're a CRS community, or even if you're not, and you're wondering about what properties are on the National Violation Tracker, I'd say follow up with Georgia DNR for those details. I did want to point out one last thing here. LOMARs do not directly affect rates. I mentioned that earlier. So think about, you've got this property here on the right-hand side. You go in, you mitigate, you reduce the risk. In the old days, that would all turn into Zone X. Maybe even nowadays it'd be a Zone X, which is great. But again, changes in zone do not affect rates. So those people might be expecting to see a drop in their insurance rates. If it becomes a Zone X, you could drop the mandatory purchase requirement, but unfortunately, that means they might drop their policy. So the premium would still be rated no differently than with the mitigation or without the mitigation project. We're talking to FEMA saying, how can we update the data more quickly so it does reflect the lower risk, but they've got the CAT models, they've got FEMA's maps, et cetera, all to, and the elevation data from USGS to help all coordinate together to say it's a lower risk. So just be aware of that. And as I mentioned, finally, in the levies, if a levy is not in the national levy database, it's not being analyzed. If it is in the national levy database, but it's not a federal levy, then the people who do the levy performance are only on core levies. So therefore, if it's doesn't have a levy performance done, it will be treated, quote, as an average. And even though it might be better than average, it will be only rated as an average. And we found that can make a difference of 25% in premium. FEMA's aware that they need to work on it with the core, but there's no solution to that at this time. All right. Coming to the home stretch. Any questions? Okay.
Not yet.
All right. I'm not hearing any, and that's kind of what I did to my hair in trying to understand all of this program. So let me finish up with what I call the FEMA LAGNAP, kind of some leftover extra stuff I wanted to highlight. The first one is a FEMA initiative called Direct to Consumer. It's a quoting tool, just like you can go online and quote for auto or even homeowners. It's a very easy process. They came out with it just a couple months ago, and I strongly encourage anyone on this phone to go in and do their own home. This is not an estimate. This is an actual quote that you can, at the end of it, email it to an agent at the bottom of the page or email it to your agent and go ahead and process a policy. Very easy to use. I'll give you a warning. It uses the FEMA database for that elevation. So you may have an EC, or you might want to say, hey, I wonder if I elevate my house 2 feet, like Bruce was talking about, what would that cost savings be? You can't do that. It does not allow you to change elevation. I was just on a meeting yesterday with FEMA, and this was brought up by several people, and the comment back was, yes, we hear that a lot, but right now we're just trying to roll out and get this tool out to everybody and get it used and tweak the minor stuff before we make any major changes. So read into that what you will on how long it will take before that change is inputted. But it's something that I know, for example, ASFPM and its members have been calling for a lot, because in the old days you had a tool, it was called a table, and in the rating manual you could quickly say, hey, you're going to have an X% discount in your premium if you elevate 1, 2, or 3 feet. Well, we don't have that under this method. The other initiatives to talk about, one is an installment plan. FEMA directed back in 2014, maybe 12 as well, you need to come up with an installment plan. Well, FEMA's finally getting around to it. They just put notice in the Federal Register to change the wording of the flood bill that was put in back in '68 and updated since then to allow them to do the installment plan. So now they can actually move forward with it. Hopefully it'll be out by the end of this year, early next year. The other initiative is they're looking to update the flood insurance policy form, starting with the homeowners. They're looking to actually write a new one. And I will tell you that when they put it out for comment, the flood insurance industry sent back about 26 pages of comments on things that FEMA should be aware of, work on, and improve before they roll it out finally. So I haven't heard anything more on that. Finally, the program does expire March 14th. The Congress successfully kicked the can the 32nd time here last month. And so we'll see how much traction it gets with the new Congress and new administration in there. I get questions about a lawsuit. Yes, a lawsuit was filed a year and a half ago, both by states and parishes and communities, and then another one by policy holders. And those are on track to start trial in May and June at this time, is the latest news. Finally, policy count, just how are things going? Nationally wise, we are seeing a drop in the policy count. We've lost over 200,000 in the past just couple years since the rollout of this new rating methodology. Don't know if it's directly to it. What's helped is Florida does require flood insurance for their citizens, the coastal policies, and that we've actually seen an increase while we're seeing decreases in other areas like Texas and Louisiana. Finally, finish up with resources. Again, we've got, you can go to these. I won't spend much time, but this is a great resource. Bookmark this for all those things you see on there, especially if you want to know the latest on bulletins or the manuals. I love the data and analytics, but I'm a flood nerd. Have this on your website linked, floodsmart.gov. It's a great consumer web page, and it's also really good for you all to just learn the basics or understand, or if you have basic questions about the NFIP and the flood program. Especially have a whole section about flood maps. Let the agents in your area know that there is an agent-specific website to help them write policies, understand about flood map changes, et cetera. And they've got a great resource library. Georgia has a guidebook for community officials around map changes. This has additional stuff plus others that you can use yourself and just change the word from client to property owner. So bookmark this one for sure for a great resource of marketing material. And finally, for you flood nerds out there like me and want to learn more about the NFIP's pricing approach, here's a couple links there as well. When you talk to real estate professionals, they've got several different resources that you can share with them about flood insurance. Again, we want them to understand it, but always say, go talk to your agent to learn more. I have, when you get this, the links are embedded in that, as well as the link to the real estate agent toolkit. Again, super resources for the realtor in your area. Finally, I'll finish up to see if there's any more questions, and I have one slide after that. Are there any questions?
Bruce, you're doing just such a fantastic job that there are no questions.
Actually, I did have a slide here which showed a guy who passed out on his laptop with too much information in his head. So maybe I should have put that one. But with that, I just want to say it's been an absolute pleasure working with FEMA Region 4, with you guys, Emily, and the Georgia DNR staff and the Dewberry-Atkins team. And also over the years, starting back with doing M.A.P mod and trying to get all the 500 and some odd counties up to speed and updated in M.A.P mod. I've enjoyed working with the local officials and their staff and helping make Georgia a more resilient place there to work and live. So as I head to the sunset there at the end of the month of this month, again, I just want to thank you guys for the opportunity to work with you all. So with that, I will flip it over to you to see if there's any questions and let you bring it home.
All right. Well, Bruce, I don't know if you can look at the chat, but there are quite a few people who are thanking you for the presentation and everything that you have done for Georgia and Georgia DNR, and as well as all of the communities.
Oh, thank you.
I'm going to miss you, and I know there are other people as well. They'll miss your guidance through all of this. For those who are still with us, we are keeping the chat open for a few more minutes. So if you do have a question, throw it in there along with your email address so we can follow up with you. Please mark March 12th from 12 to 1 on your calendar for our next Lunch and Learn webinar, where we'll be discussing FFRMS, implementation by HUD and FEMA. Please make note of the registration link for the next webinar and survey link in the chat and on the screen. Again, we greatly appreciate you completing the survey so that we can improve these webinars. We are offering 1 hour of continuing education credit for today's session, available to certified floodplain managers that completed the polling questions and provide their name and email address in the chat right now. Don't forget to add your name. A copy of the presentation will be emailed to all attendees. If you're requesting continuing education credits, those certificates will be emailed separately. Once more, our next Lunch and Learn webinar is scheduled in March, so be on the lookout for that invitation. With that, thank you again for attending today's event. For those of you who don't have any other questions, this ends our Lunch and Learn webinar. Have a great day, everybody. And again, Bruce, thank you so much.
My pleasure. My pleasure.